But what I want to present to you is something, the larger picture of what we're talking about, and why the guilds, they are important. Again, what is important here is to understand the idea of a model. What society do we want to create? Is that the model London in the 20th century? The famous Wawasan Duapolo, no? You know, it developed a European state. Or is the pattern the model of Medina? These are two different societies, but in particular, in this particular issue, we find a very conclusive conflict. And that is, in order to create the modern society, the guilds had to be destroyed. The guilds did not die out of natural causes. The guilds were murdered. Historically, they were murdered. And they were murdered legally, and they were murdered through two institutions that they were in rising. One is the banks, and the second is the state. The state legislated in favor of those banks, and the banks broke down this so-called monopoly that the guilds had. And here we are going to go back to a very important matter, which is how these Orientalists and these historians told us about the death of the guilds. The story as it goes is that the guilds were inefficient, and they had been replaced by something much more efficient and much better, which is in fact the modern factory, and with the impulse of the capital that came from the banking system, and therefore that model was better. Okay, that's the story. So the story is a case of something old being replaced by something new, something less efficient being replaced by something more efficient. That's the story. That's what everybody has bought, and that's why nobody discussed the matter. If it was that easy, if it was just a matter of fact, there would have not been the need of abolishing the guilds, laws to abolish the guilds. You know, if there is a fair competition, if Barcelona has to play against Malaysian Football Club, you don't need to abolish Malaysian Football Club. No, let them play, because the outcome is clear. But when they get Malaysian Football Club and they cripple them, and they take 10 players off, and they are left with one, and they tilted the field, and they make the goalpost much bigger and theirs narrower, and then you say they lost, then you say, well, they lost because they had no chance. Okay? So this is what happened. Now, we're talking about historical phenomena, so therefore there's a certain degree of documentation, then take it and reinterpret it in a manner that it suits the winners. But there is one very important moment in our history, which is the invasion of Egypt. It almost precedes the fall of the Ottoman Empire. It was the crack, the breaking down of the Dar al-Islam. It was first done through influence and trading with the British, then the French came in, they took over, and then eventually the English came back again after Napoleon, and they took it back again, and it became a British colony, and then it became the model of how they were going to break down our societies. What happened in Egypt in that later part of the 19th century is what they did to every Muslim society after that. The pattern was the same, and the mischievousness in which it was achieved, it was a remarkable. How they break down Egypt is how they broke down Malaysia, and how they broke down Pakistan, and how they broke down everybody else. So it's very important to understand it. First of all, there was political control and military control, so there was no doubt who's in charge. But then they get, and we choose the muftis. So they choose the mufti. And I mean, when you see your enemy, right, and he takes over your nation, enslave your people, kills all your people, and then that governor chooses one man as the mufti, and then he goes around with this big thing, and then you don't say this is a great Muslim leader, do you? Most people will, under duress. But at least, if you are so scared that you cannot say anything to this figure, at least you have the historical capacity to say, well, that generation, my father couldn't do it, but he was a traitor. Right? At least that. So when you hear Muhammad Abdu was chosen by Lord Cromer as the chief mufti of Egypt, you don't go saying this is the greatest Muslim leader ever. Have. Alright? Because there must be something in you to say, if you hold on a minute, it cannot be. It cannot be. I mean, despite what he said, you can make any story, but you have to say to yourself, this is the man chosen by my enemy. Now, I'm telling you this. You take Muhammad Abdu out of the picture. Al-Afghani, Muhammad Abdu, Rashid Reda, Hassan al-Banna, and Maududi, and there is no Islam left. No teaching left. And they all come from Muhammad Abdu. And if you want to know where somebody stands ideologically, you say, and what do you say Muhammad Abdu? And if they tell you he was the greatest leader ever, that's it. Lakum dinukum waliyadin. That's what the people of that generation did. When Sheikh Ali saw Muhammad Abdu coming into Al-Azhar, he was an old gentleman. He stood up with his stick. He stood up and to hit him in the head and to say, you kafir, get out of here. In a famous incident. This is how Sheikh Ali, who was the head of the Maliki Madhab in Al-Azhar, just the last one, because after that it was a total disaster, and there's no teaching ever since. That's what he saw in Muhammad Abdu. There is an organization in Indonesia called Muhammadiyah, not because of Muhammad Rasulullah. And Nahdlatul Ulama, just the same. And if you look at the Islamic Party and the leaders of the Islamic Party, and you say where they have been trained, then you say, no wonder. This is what we are dealing with. Now, most people don't even know that, okay? They don't even know. Why? Because the biography that is the official biography of all the fundamentalists, the so-called fundamentalists, is the one written by Rashid Reda, which is a complete fantasy like Peter Pan. It's a complete, total, nonsensical re-evaluation of this figure. And that's the one everybody has read. So when now it has been totally demonstrated with documentation that he was a Freemason, the people say, oh no, it cannot be. Why? It cannot be. Do you think Lord Cromer just chose a radical Islamic figure to be in charge of the Mufti? And when the first fatwa that he gives is that the interest from the post office is halal, under Muhammad Abdu, the law of the abolition of the Egyptian guilds was passed. The guilds were abolished by the British because they could not hold society at ransom and enslave them with those autonomous institutions. because the people were independent, because they didn't depend on the state, because they had their own pensions, because they had their own hospitals, because they had their own education, because they were a free society. So they could not enslave them, they were in conflict with them, so they said, abolish them. And they started to grant monopolies to individuals with the massive loan given by the banks. So where in the old days, the means of production, the factories, the tools, the main means of productions were owned by the people in a waqf. Now it's owned by one individual with the money given by the banks. And that money, you know where it comes from. It's paper money, for God's sake. The biggest fraud on earth. And whoever doesn't understands this, he doesn't have any spirituality, zero. If you cannot see that, you cannot see at all. Alright? Not only that, if you don't talk about this, because you think other things are more important, then go ahead. But your spirituality remains zero on one single account. Is what Sheikh Darqawi said. Deal with the big problems first and with the smaller ones later. Because when you are attacked with a tiger and a mosquito at the same time, to defend yourself against the mosquito is suicidal. And what is the big problem? Well, riba is the big problem. And what happens with riba in our societies? It has become the smallest problem. In fact, it doesn't really matter at all. In fact, it doesn't matter. It's so legalized that it's above the Quran. In a new law called the Constitution that is above the Quran. But never mind, because you have a mufti that said this is an Islamic constitution. But it's actually a tragedy. And then you have the population running into this kind of pseudo-nonsense with a resemblance to Islam, but only a resemblance in as much as resemblance means its appearance. So for example, the formality of the dress, sine qua non. I mean, there is no a period of history in the Malaysian history where the women have been so covered. Never. There has been no other moment in Malaysian history since the start of Islam where you haven't been so kafir. And you have to put the two together. You say, oh, we have made our appearances so amazing while we are rotten inside, completely rotten, sold out. And you have to say, what happens to us? How are we becoming frivolous? Is that all we are cared is how we look? And what happened in your heart? Where's that desire to fight, to put the things right, to say the things right? You follow. So the guilds were murdered, and the murder started before Egypt, in France itself. French Revolution, just before the French Revolution. Necker, I think it was, abolished the guilds in France. Now, if you want to create a popular revolution, how do you abolish the guilds? What was the logic of that?